I've been having an absolute blast with Expedition 33. And so far, I've played through the entire game and even entered a New Game Plus on Expert difficulty, the highest. But looking around, I noticed there are relatively few builds that cater to Expert difficulty, as most people are playing on Expeditioner and Story. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm maybe making this video for a very small crowd of people. But in today's video, I'm going to be talking about the build that I used to go through the early portion of the game, so roughly the first 20-ish levels, on Expert difficulty, for each of the characters, some of the choices I made, weapons, skills, all that fun stuff. The reason this is important is because on the higher difficulties, enemies are very aggressive, they're faster, therefore they get more turns, and they attack you a lot. The downside of this is, because they hit very hard, they may just straight up one-shot you. Defenses are not nearly as effective as on the lower difficulties. The upside is, if you can parry, you get a lot of extra counterattack damage, so you may actually kill enemies faster in some cases, and you get to use high AP cost skills, which are really fun. And so first I'm going to go through the setups that I used on Gustave, Lune, Maelle, and Sciel, and then wrap everything up with how it went, because there are definitely some times when my build wasn't optimal and the game punished me for it. Though I found most of that was in side content following the main story, even on Expert difficulty, it felt pretty darn balanced. Also, if you're curious about more Expert difficulty builds, especially what I'm playing right now in the Endgame or New Game Plus, please let me know down in the comments below, and also get subscribed so you don't miss the upload if I make it. For now, let's get into things. Starting with Gustave, who I built out for free aim shots because I needed someone to break the enemy weak points, and I realized if I have Gustave do it, very often the enemies don't even get a turn provided I open with first strike. Now, also as a note, while I do have a Delaram equipped, your weapon doesn't really matter because unlike all the other characters, your weapons don't get special effects on Gustave. Also, his skills are way more limited, so I suspect there's not that many builds for him. But the important thing to note about that is, you should, in general, look for a weapon that has either luck or agility scaling, as that provides a good bit of damage. Those are useful stats to have anyway. And you should try to use a weapon that the enemy's weak to, so if the enemy's weak to light, maybe Delaram. Now in terms of skills, I'm using Lumiere Assault and Overcharge, the two he starts with, then Powerful to buff everyone in the party, Recovery in case I need some healing. Honestly, I didn't use this too much, so I probably should have dropped it for Strike Storm. Then there's Marking Shot, really good for setting up for a high hit from another character like Maelle. And Shatter, which is an AoE break, does pretty good damage, and if you use it in place of something like Lumiere Assault to break an enemy, all of a sudden, you have full charge and can overcharge, which is probably going to break the enemy again, which is a really fun combo. To facilitate this, and so that I could use Shatter on my first turn if I needed, I ran all the Energizing Start stuff. Well, kind of. I don't have Energizing Start 1 in here, which costs 5 Lumina. That's just because it was either that or SOS Shell. I thought the defenses were pretty good. Though I guess First Strike, arguably, may be worth dropping against weaker enemies. You absolutely want it against tougher stuff like Chromatics and bosses, though. So Dead Energy 2, pretty good crit rate. Energizing Start, good chunk of health, plus I wanted the AP anyway, and Energizing Start again, more health, and I wanted the AP anyway. Here at Critical Burn, I would consider this to be mandatory. You're going to see it on almost all the characters. Same with Dead Energy 2, by the way. It is 25% crit chance as long as the enemy is burning. You can make the enemies burn pretty easily. And then for the rest, I'm putting SOS Shell on most characters. It's a nice defensive buffer. First Strike, to go first in those crucial boss battles. And then Augmented Aim, Burning Shots, and Marking Shots, because if you are using Free Aim Shot, you want to be able to apply things like Burn and Mark. Doesn't happen all the time, but you know what? 20% of the time, it happens 100% of the time. And that is the first time out of 2 that I'm going to make that joke in this video. For attributes, Might's pretty good for damage. Late game, it starts to fall off. And then whatever your weapon scales off of, but do make sure you have at least some crit and a little agility. Otherwise, the enemies are kind of just going to go faster than you, and you're not going to crit enough. Next up, moving on to Lune, who I kind of struggled to build, not because she doesn't have good options, but because she has too many options, and a lot of them are surprisingly good. But I ended up going with a roulette build. Or more accurately, shortly after playing through the early game, I realized a roulette build was better than what I'm doing, so this is what I'm going to recommend. In addition, Breaker, pretty good crit rate, also increased break damage. First Strike, gotta go first. Some Energizing Start to make sure her skills activate. But let's talk about the roulette mechanic here. Every hit has a 50% chance to either deal 50% or 100% damage. Because it is every hit, if you have something like Electrify, if it hits 3 times, that means you roll 3 dice, or maybe flip 3 coins. Heads, you win 200% damage. Tails, you lose 50% damage. This rewards you for using skills that hit a lot rather than hitting hard. Because if you would hit for the damage cap of 10,000 without roulette, then it is all downside with no upside. In fact, even if you're hitting for like 7,000, I'm pretty sure that mathematically it starts being only downside and not upside. The thing about that is, that's not the gambler mentality. So what this really says is 100% of the time, do 200% of the damage. This works 50% of the time. But now let's talk about the skills and weapons because there are a few options here. Electrify is a really good spammable skill, and with this weapon, lightning skills cost 1 less AP, so it is free. It costs 0. And I really like that because it generates lightning stains, which can be used to set up for earth skills, like say, Earth Rising, or Rock Slide, with a little bit of help from other stuff. Now, Immolate is a good way to inflict burn on one enemy. I mostly used this for burn maintenance on bosses due to its low AP cost. Wildfire is much better against trash, and also Wildfire generates light and fire, which when combined with Electrify is pretty good. And it sets you up for some of the higher cost skills. Rock Slide can break, hits decently hard, also multi-hit. Earth Rising, not multi-hit, unfortunately, not so great for roulette, but it consumes lightning for damage, and those are really easy to generate. Plus it's AoE, and Lightning Dance hits very hard, and it hits 6 times, and what that means is you have 6 chances, or if you crit enough, 12 chances for your roulette. But Lightning Dance is also a pretty significant point investment, so if you don't like it too much, you can drop both Lightning Dance and Earth Rising. This would also mean you could use some alternative weapons. For example, if you want to lean into the fire stuff more, you would go Lighter Rim and just spam Wildfire on AoE. In this case, you'd probably want to build towards the far left skill Hell, but you won't be unlocking that for a bit. Alternatively, if you wanted to really gamble, you could use Trebuchet, where on free aim shot, which you should have enough AP for, provided you're not using Lightning Dance, you'll get a random stain. And because it's random, I would swap this out, and I would swap this out. In place of Lightning Dance, use Thunderfall. This is empowered by a single fire, which is a much easier condition to meet, and it can still hit 6 times. And then, in addition, you just take Mayhem. This consumes all stains, it doesn't care about what type, so if you get a bunch of stains that you can't otherwise use, just dump them with Mayhem. Unfortunately, for damage, it's going to be a little bit less consistent just because of roulette, but the more stains you have, the more consistent it's going to be. Also, because I was using Demonarum, I took some extra agility. You might want to put that into something else depending on the scaling stats on your item. Like let's say here, Vitality, you'd actually want to dump that into there, even if Vitality isn't giving you that much defensively. Then you have Maelle, which was my hard hitter. Oh boy, did she do a lot of damage. So auto shell this way, instead of shell when she gets low, just shell from the start. Breaking counter and augmented first strike are both useful, but also they just have really good stats, especially the crit rate. Critical burn shouldn't be too surprising. Energizing start to have a strong turn 1. And the main idea here is put burn up on the enemy if you need. Otherwise, make them defenseless. This one is more cost efficient for bosses. This one is pretty good for trash. Then use Swift Stride once the enemy is burning to get into Virtue Stance. Now early on, using Pierce in Virtue Stance is your hardest hitting skill. It is very, very good for damage, but it also damage caps pretty quickly actually, especially if a target's marked. So instead, you want to swap to something like this. It's multi-hit, and it can break, and you can stay in Virtue Stance. But honestly, none of these are your ultimate endgame. Your ultimate endgame is Sword Ballet, because this thing hits incredibly hard in Virtue Stance. Crits deal double damage, so you'll basically damage cap with every hit, and it hits 5 times. Unfortunately, it's far bottom right, so it's going to take a little bit to get the points to unlock. Now for weapons, there's 2 things I'd recommend. The first is Brularum. So on any crit, Maelle can apply burn. This is really good for keeping burn active on bosses, as it just kind of happens passively. But if you want to take things out before they even get to act, I would recommend Medallum, because this starts you in Virtue Stance where you have the biggest damage bonus. Though unfortunately, after you've exited Virtue Stance, you don't really get any special bonuses from this weapon, so it's not as good on longer fights. Then last up, Sciel, who I built out as a lone wolf character. So I'm using Accelerating Last Stand Critical, Protecting Last Stand, and Solo Fighter. All of these boost Sciel's stats crazily if she is the only person in the fight, so just her and all the enemies. There are two ways to do this. One would be to set Sciel as the only active party member. Therefore, if she is KO'd, these three will come in. And then alternatively, you can do, well, the reverse, where these three are the active party, and if they are KO'd, Sciel comes in to clean things up. Also, if you're wondering why I have no luck when earlier I said it's good for crit, and why I'm not using critical burn, well, last stand critical. She's always going to be alone, so she has 100% chance to crit, thus doesn't need the investment. For skills, the first things that I would recommend are Bad Omen and Marking Card. Marking Card is good because you can set up for a big hit like Phantom Blade, and Bad Omen is good because it applies Foretell and deals AoE damage. After this, you want Sealed Fate, because when it crits, it doesn't consume Foretell. So, you get the 200% more damage bonus from having Foretell on the enemy. It is 4 AP, which means you can pretty much just spam it. This thing is awesome. It does tons of damage, and it is the skill that carried my early game. Though late game, there are better options. And then Harvest for some healing, though I didn't use this too often. Later on, your best friend is going to be Dark Wave, because Dark Wave is super good, hits a lot of times, and the AP cost isn't too bad. Now, weapon-wise, I actually stuck with her default weapon for a long time, but if you want to go a little bit out of your comfort zone, there is another weapon that does offer more damage, but has a really big downside. And apparently I scrolled right past it. Here we go, Chadian. Sun skills always apply 10 Foretell. So if you use something like Marking Card, now it is 10 Foretell, but Sciel's damage taken is doubled, so everything will be a one-shot. If you are okay with everything being a one-shot and defenses literally not mattering, use Chadian because it applies a ton of damage. Especially because that means you can mark with something and then use Phantom Blade if it's going to consume all 10 Foretell and hit like an absolute truck. And so that's how I built each of my characters. Again, I actually really struggled with how to build Lune, not because she's bad, in fact quite the opposite, because there's plenty of other ways to play her. For example, you can use Thermal Transfer to give yourself extra turns, and for a bit, I was doing that. On Gustave, the build options are a little bit more limited. I'm sure you don't have to build into Mark Shot. You can just rely on his skills, but since he has so many less skills and no special weapon abilities, I didn't feel like there was too much flexibility. And on Maelle, you could absolutely go full fire, going into things like Degagement to make enemies more vulnerable to fire, and then further enhancing that with something like Rain of Fire. Rain of Fire is a multi-hit skill that inflicts burn. It's pretty darn good. The problem is it's left side, and for Sword Ballet, I wanted to go right side. So again, I was building Maelle for how the character ended up turning out in Act 2, not necessarily the 100% most optimal thing in Act 1. I also think you'd go with a fully solo setup on Maelle. You'd lose out on the marking synergy, but Pierce ends up hitting so hard that it doesn't really matter. And instead of Sciel, you'd have Maelle either go in first and kill all the enemies, or clean up if the party's wiped. The main reason that I didn't want to do this is because with Brularum, she acted as a really good support for the party, keeping critical burn active for everyone else, and it seemed kind of wasteful to have her go off on her own when she didn't really need the damage bonus. Now in general, I don't think you need to play around the damage cap too much in Act 1. You just don't hit all that hard in the early game, especially with the extra defense that enemies get on Expert. But later on it is something that I was thinking about, which is why I ended up building a lot of my characters for multi-hit, and why on some of them I didn't even consider roulette for a very long time, because after all, if you're hitting for 10,000 already, roulette is all downside with no upside. That said, Lune is the one character that both hits frequently enough that the misses didn't really annoy me, and also hits for low enough numbers on each individual strike, especially with the lightning skills, that I found it to be extremely helpful. Though again, if it low rolling annoys you, do feel free to eliminate it. With that said, I'm sure these are not the only way to build these characters. This is just how I did it, based on my own experiences. So if you're playing through the game on Expert, let me know some of your thoughts down below. Hey, maybe even go over to Maxroll, make a planner, and share it with the community, because I am really curious about what builds other people are cooking up. Speaking of, if you want to reference anything that I've talked about in this video, there will be a planner linked down in the description below. That said, I want to get back to playing more Expedition 33. I need to explore New Game Plus and try some endgame builds. If I find anything really cool, I'm probably going to share it in another video, so get subscribed if that sounds interesting to you. Also, if you want to know how to get the Last Stand Pictos, I have a guide for that. They're in the Hidden Gestural Arena, and I'll link to that video up in the card and down below. For now, I'm going to get going, so thank you very much for watching to the end. I'm glad you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.